It's back to the COVID inquiry, and this closing statement from the Bereaved Families for Justice UK is well worth watching as it sums up the government's handling of the pandemic.
My lady, as you know, I make submissions on behalf of the COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK. My lady, according to members of his own team, for Boris Johnson's skill set, COVID was the wrong crisis. He was referred to as a trolley by his most senior advisor, oscillating from one position to another, said his head of communications, and as having ostrich syndrome by one of his own ministers. They're not my words, they're not the family's words, they're not the words of his political adversaries. They are the words from people within Mr. Johnson's own team. Regrettably for the bereaved families, and regrettably for the whole country, COVID exposed the weaknesses of Mr. Johnson and the fractious nature of his dysfunctional administration. For the thousands that we represent, Mr. Johnson is the reason that many of them are here. He was the captain of HMS United Kingdom, pretending that the iceberg it was steaming towards was a figment of the imagination. All the while, his lieutenant, Matt Hancock, was conducting the orchestra to play on deck, telling all that everything was fine and plans were in place. Unfortunately, the reality was the opposite. The iceberg was only too real, and it was the plans which were a figment of the imagination. In his evidence, Mr. Johnson acknowledged that mistakes had been made, and he said that as the PM at the time, he accepted personal responsibility for them. Anyone watching might have thought this was a laudable approach until Mr. Keith asked him the question that all of us who'd actually read Mr. Johnson's witness statement were thinking. What mistakes was he actually saying sorry for? It is, of course, a matter for you, but you may think that through his whole evidence, Mr. Johnson hardly acknowledged any failures. If that is your view, then his apologies were hollow, and you may think designed to demonstrate a humility, a previously undiagnosed characteristic. There is no foundation whatsoever for the narrative that, despite the criticisms and predictions, the UK did okay. This bold, sweeping assertion is remarkable for one thing. It has no factual basis. If there was a basis for it, no doubt Mr. Johnson and his team of lawyers would have exhibited the evidence. They have not. Mr. Johnson continued to deflect away from awkward facts and evidence by hand-wringing about how it had all been different if only we could have seen the problem coming over the horizon, and in particular asymptomatic transmission, and telling us that the real problem was that no one knew where the UK was on the curve until we were into March. Once again, we say that reality, awkward things called facts and evidence, get in the way of his narrative. The reality was that in January and February 2020, he was telling those that would listen that this was a false alarm and that the overreaction would damage the economy. Eminent scientists were under no such delusion. By early January, the UK had designated COVID as a high-consequence infectious disease. What was done regarding PPE? It is crystal clear that as of January, there were insufficient stockpiles of PPE. No one seems to have known what there was and where. There also seems to have been scant understanding of need, in particular in the care sector, and no real distribution or management plan. By mid-March, PPE requirements for doctors and nurses and cleaners and others working in COVID wards were downgraded. I repeat, downgraded. We say the only reason for this was the lack of proper PPE. Why? Partly because of the failure to stockpile and plan for management during a crisis, and partly because of a failure to surge manufacturing or procurement capacity once the pandemic was on the horizon. There seems to be almost unanimity amongst witnesses that the first lockdown could not have been avoided. Equally, it should have been sooner. Mr. Hancock says the beginning of March. Patrick Vallance said the lockdown was at least a week too late. So the message we say is clear. It should have been earlier and harder. I say unanimity amongst witnesses because it will not have escaped your attention, my lady, that there have been a number of tabloid articles and questions by some politicians and other commentators as to whether lockdowns were necessary at all. Apparently, they were anathema to some halcyon days of British libertarian values, and the cost was too high. We have no doubt that you'll have no hesitation in following the evidence and tuning out from the background noise outside of these walls. Where evidence has questioned the need for the efficiency of lockdowns, it has been carefully dealt with. You'll recall the dismantling of the Great Barrington Declaration hypothesis by Professor Whitty, the idea that the vulnerable could be shielded whilst the rest of us got on with life as normal. Quite how the vulnerable were to be defined and identified was the first problem, but shielding them whilst the virus circulated amongst the rest of the population would have been impossible. There is nothing anti-libertarian about temporary emergency public health measures to save lives, any more than there is anything authoritarian about the binding legal requirement on the state to do everything reasonably possible to protect life pursuant to Article 2 of the European Convention of Human Rights. Sorry to disappoint those who would cast lockdowns as part of a culture war, but the Human Rights Act and English common law are both agreed on this. The fallacy of the lockdown argument is that there is some balance to be struck between public health damage and the economy and other societal damage. Protecting lives protected the economy and minimised other societal damage. Protecting the economy required decisive, swift action, not standing back. Protecting the economy goes hand in hand with a healthy workforce, and that requires first-rate health services with resilience when there's an emergency. Having suggested that they first followed the science with respect to measures up to and including the first lockdown, Mr Johnson and Mr Sunak then embarked on Eat Out to help out. Having successfully, if belatedly, reduced the infection rate, this policy provided state subsidies for people to gather for long periods in enclosed spaces. Despite the assertion from Mr Johnson that it had been considered and advanced by Professors Whitty and Vallance, that was plainly not the case. Again, there was almost unanimity that Eat Out to help out was a terrible idea, and one which witness after witness would have counselled against if only they'd been asked. Although it's difficult to evidence the effect of Eat Out to help out, Patrick Vallance was able to say that it must have increased infection rates and highly likely to have increased the number of deaths. The science was not followed. Instead, the government embarked upon a series of tiering measures which were doomed to fail and did so. What is most striking about the tier system was the government did not seek advice from SAGE or anyone else about it. What this demonstrates, my lady, is that even in the face of a realisation of the dire situation developing over summer 2020, Mr Johnson and his government floundered in the face of ideological opposition and ignored scientific advice. The result was a colossal loss of life in a second wave and a longer and more damaging second lockdown. I want to pick up on three more threads. Following the science, the failure to mitigate foreseeable disproportionate impacts, and governance. There is also a common golden thread, a lack of proper systems in place, crucial for when the next storm gathers. On the evidence, it is clear that an eclectic mix of eminent and concerned scientists were raising the alarm as the pandemic emerged. It is equally clear that many eminent scientists came together as volunteers in the pop-up committee that was SAGE and did their level best. This is not an attack on any of the scientists. We are well equipped with eminent experts in all four corners of the United Kingdom. My lady, in terms of governance, the evidence has exposed the shortcomings of the workings of central government. Below the ministerial level, we have seen the interface of the political officials and civil servants. In many, perhaps most administrations, this may work perfectly well, with clear demarcation of roles and due deference between them. However, we have witnessed what happens when that is absent, with an avowed disruptor brought into the centre. He, who Mr Johnson could not bring himself to name in evidence, was given almost unfettered power and used it, or more accurately, misused it. Undeniably, Dominic Cummings and others around him were allowed to create a toxic atmosphere, white and male, which scared off competent others and created a dysfunctionality we have seen through countless messages stirring up internecine conflict. Add to that a culture of indifference to abiding by their own regulations, and the evidence exposes the Johnson administration to have been rotten to its core. How to put that right is another matter. Professionalising the system of SPADs and political appointees is more difficult, still as it performs part of the democratic remit of governance. But there are potential measures which the inquiry may consider, such as a transparent system of reviewing diversity and culture at the heart of government, which may be appropriate going forward. My lady, you will note that I have made it through this short submission without reference to the detail of the messaging or the language. Ingenious devices have been advanced by many as to why the inquiry should take a circumspect view of WhatsApps and emails and late-night notes. Whilst accepting that they have a different status to formal meeting minutes, we reject all attempts to diminish their importance. This evidence is not ephemeral, as has been suggested. Sounding off, some of them might be. More brutal due to the brevity of WhatsApp character limit, maybe. But these are generally invaluable contemporaneous evidence which every forensic process seeks. My lady, if the failings of Mr Johnson, Mr Sunak, Mr Hancock, Mr Cummings and others are laid bare by their own unguarded comments, they only have themselves to blame.
Click here for Rishi Sunak's guide to backing up WhatsApp messages.